In this video, I'm going to show you how to harness two-factor authentication with Internet Single Sign-On. I'm going to be building on JOSSO Enterprise Edition for the single sign-on, and we'll use Wicked for the two-factor authentication piece. So the first thing to do is create an identity appliance. This will act as a placeholder for our combined single sign-on and two-factor authentication setting. Let's name this and provide a text description. And here we'll specify the namespace reserved for our identity appliance, and we'll also specify the web context that our identity appliance will be servicing requests from. Everything looks good, so let's move on. Okay, now the first thing we're going to do is set up our identity provider. This represents the piece that's responsible for asserting user identity. Let's go ahead and name our identity provider. Defaults are fine, so we'll make no changes here. Now it's time to define our authoritative source for user and entitlement information. In this case, we're going to use the built-in user repository. We drag the Identity Vault element into the diagram and name it accordingly. Now, the identity provider and our identity source do not know each other. So in order to make the identity provider build on the Identity Vault to obtain user and entitlement information, we're going to go ahead and we'll connect both elements using the identity lookup connection. Once we've set up the building blocks for our single sign-on service, it's time to specify the consumer end, which is commonly known as service providers. So let's add a first service provider. And we'll name it My Java App 1. We'll get our service provider to trust the user claims that the identity provider makes by making it a member of the Circle of Trust. In order to do this, we use the federated connection, thus linking the identity provider and the service provider together. Okay, now moving downward toward the implementation aspects of our setting. We're going to include in our diagram one of the execution environments hosting our applications. In this case, it's a Tomcat instance. We're going to specify where the software is installed. And we'll choose to deploy the sample app as well. Now it's time to tell JOSSO that our first service provider will be hosted within this web container. We're going to use the activation connection to accomplish this. Now we need to specify the base URI from which the web application is servicing requests. In this case, we're going to use a pre-integrated example application. And now we'll go ahead and repeat the same procedure for our second service provider. We'll go ahead and name this second application My Java App 2. We've made it a member of the Circle of Trust, and we'll host it in a different execution environment. In this case, it's a JBoss 4.2 application server. Let's bind our second Java application to the newly created execution environment. Now the next step is to make sure that JOSSO support is provisioned into our execution environments. And we can accomplish this by activating both the Apache Tomcat and JBoss execution environments. Let's start with the Apache Tomcat one first. Done. Next, the JBoss execution environment. Okay, now it's time to set up Wicked for introducing two-factor authentication capabilities to our single sign-on setting. We've already set up Wicked, namely the trust system on top of which it operates, which is based on public key infrastructure. Okay, now it's time to specify an authentication domain, a segmentation of authentication authority in which any given device can participate. Clients will refer to this domain as demo, and we'll specify in the server code field the location to which both JOSSO and two-factor authentication devices will refer when they're consuming Wicked services. Here's our newly created domain. Now let's launch our Wicked software token and point it to our Wicked domain. You've got to make sure that this is the same server code that has been defined for our domain. and let's set the PIN to protect our wicked token from unauthorized access. Okay, the wicked token has now registered successfully with the code shown in the screen. And now we accept the registration request, thus enabling the device to consume wicked services. And here's the registration request we've just submitted. Let's link this device to a specific user account, user 1 in this case. Now that we've enabled the wicked token end to consume wicked services, we need to allow the single sign-on piece to consume the same services in order to realize two-factor authentication use cases. From the wicked perspective, JOSSO is considered a network client, so let's add an entry for it. Now, we've named it as the host JOSSO uses to service requests, but this can actually be whatever you want. Here's the IP address where JOSSO will query wicked services. Here's the protocol that it will use, and the domain. Now it's time to enter the details that generate the digital certificate conveyed by JOSSO when JOSSO is connecting to wicked to authenticate the exchange. Make sure to write down the PKCS12 passphrase. You'll need to enter it later to complete the JOSSO setup. So this is a dump for the X.509 certificate we've just created. And now let's download it. Later on, you'll upload this to JOSSO, and you will also have to download the CA Cert Store from OptWicked Private. Now back to JOSSO. We need to enable the two-factor authentication capabilities. By default, JOSSO is using simple username password authentication. Now here let's drag the wicked authentication to the diagram. And we'll fill in the server host field with the IP address or host name for our wicked server. This is the server code of our demo wicked domain. Let's upload the authority certificate for the wicked server. And now the passphrase to open it. We'll upload the network client certificate and enter the passphrase for opening this one as well. Done. Now, we can set up our identity provider so that it uses a two-factor authentication instead of using username password-based authentication. We'll use the identity verification to connect identity provider and wicked authentication elements. Okay, we're done with the modeling part. Let's save our diagram. And now let's bring our identity appliance diagram to life. We'll build our identity appliance by dragging and dropping it into the staged column. And now we deploy the identity appliance by dragging the identity appliance item from the staged to the deployed column. Now, let's go ahead and start it. And there we go. We're done. Our identity appliance is now running. Now let's go ahead and provision an entry in our identity vault for our test user. The username will be user1, and the user's a member of the role1 group, which is necessary to access the protected portions of our two service providers. Here you need to choose a password for the user, even if it will not be used in this case. Okay, we're done with setup. Now it's time to test drive our setting. Let's go ahead and try to access a protected resource on our first Java application. As you can see, a passcode is requested instead of a password. We'll go ahead and generate one from our Wicked device and enter the PIN to use it. Here's the passcode we need to type into the field in the JOSSO authentication form. Great! We've been authenticated and accessed the protected resource of our first Java application. Now let's access the protected resource of our second application. And there we go, done. We were able to access a protected resource on the second application without having to authenticate a second time, confirming that the single sign-on experience is working as expected. Thank you so much for watching today.